The wrench fell from oil-stained hands not because Paul Irvin Gunn was clumsy, but because what he saw before him represented a crossing of lines that could not be uncrossed. It was early March 1943, and the modified B-25 Mitchell bomber standing in the maintenance hangar at Port Moresby violated every regulation in the United States Army Air Force's manual. Where a bombardier should have sat behind curved plexiglass, peering through a Norden bomb sight at targets thousands of feet below, there was instead a solid metal nose bristling with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. This was not an approved modification. No technical order from right field authorized it. No engineering study had blessed it. This aircraft represented unauthorized experimentation that could easily result in a court-martial. Yet it also represented something more profound: the weaponization of grief, the transformation of personal rage into military capability, the desperate innovation of a man who had lost everything that mattered. Paul Gunn had not set out to revolutionize aerial warfare. 2 years earlier, on December 8, 1941, December 7th across the international dateline in Hawaii, he had been a civilian airline manager with a comfortable life in Manila. At 42 years old, Gunn was the manager of Philippine Airlines, overseeing a modest fleet of 4 Beech 18 civilian aircraft. He was a former Navy Chief Petty Officer who had served 20 years as an enlisted naval aviator, retiring in December 1939 after learning to fly in the 1920s and serving with the legendary Top Hatters Fighter Squadron. His technical knowledge came not from engineering textbooks but from 2 decades of hands-on experience, maintaining aircraft, flying them, crashing them, and learning from every mistake. He had instructed at Pensacola Naval Air Station, passing his hard-won wisdom to younger pilots. Now, in what should have been a peaceful semi-retirement, he managed a small airline in an American territory that seemed comfortably distant from the spreading war in Europe and China. That illusion of safety shattered on December 8, 1941, when Japanese bombers appeared over Manila. Gunn stood at Nichols Field watching the methodical destruction of American air power in the Philippines, understanding with sick certainty that everything was about to change. Within hours, Major General Louis Brereton commandeered Philippine Airlines 4 aircraft for military use and commissioned Gunn as a captain in the Army Air Forces. What should have been a temporary wartime service, perhaps a few months helping with logistics before the professionals sorted things out, would instead become a 3-year odyssey that would transform both Gunn and the nature of aerial combat in the Pacific. But in those first chaotic days, technical expertise and military rank meant nothing compared to the immediate problem facing every American in the Philippines. The Japanese were coming, and there was nowhere to hide. Gunn's family was in Manila, directly in the path of the invasion, and every passing hour brought the enemy closer. Gunn's wife, Clara Louise, called Polly by everyone who knew her, and their 4 children represented everything he had built in his post-Navy life. His 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers, old enough to understand the danger but too young to protect themselves. His daughters, Connie and Julie, were younger still. The family lived comfortably in Manila's expatriate community, part of the American presence that had governed the Philippines since the Spanish-American War. Now that entire world was collapsing with terrifying speed. In the chaotic weeks following the attack, Gunn flew reconnaissance and transport missions across the disintegrating Philippine defenses, dodging Japanese fighters and somehow surviving being shot down over the jungle. He walked out of the crash, covered in cuts and bruises, and immediately climbed into another aircraft. On one mission, he earned a Distinguished Flying Cross by flying an unarmed transport into Bataan to deliver medical supplies to besieged American troops, navigating through Japanese-controlled airspace with nothing but skill and audacity. But none of this mattered because he could not reach his family. On Christmas Eve 1941, Gunn received orders to evacuate key personnel to Australia. He drew all his military pay, borrowed as much money as he could from fellow officers, and prepared to take his family to safety. The plan was simple: get to the airfield, load them aboard a transport, and fly south ahead of the advancing Japanese forces. But the enemy moved too quickly, and the roads to the airfield were already cut. His family could not reach him in time, and the evacuation would not wait. Gunn faced the impossible choice that would define the rest of his life: abandon his family or disobey orders and condemn himself to certain capture or death. He chose to fly to Australia because orders were orders, because the war was bigger than one family, because staying meant certain death or capture without saving anyone. It was the rational decision, the military decision, the decision that any officer in his position would have made. It was also the decision that broke something fundamental inside him, a fracture that would never heal. On January 20th, 1942, approximately 3 weeks after Gunn's evacuation, Polly and the 4 children were rounded up by Japanese forces and taken to the University of Santo Tomas, which had been converted into an internment camp for enemy civilians. When Gunn learned this news through sporadic Red Cross communications, whatever remained of his pre-war self disappeared entirely. The man who continued fighting after January 1942 was not the same person who had left Manila on Christmas Eve. He had abandoned his wife and 4 children, not through cowardice but through duty, and now they were in the hands of an enemy known for brutality toward prisoners. Every day they remained in that camp was a day Gunn could not protect them, could not provide for them, could not even know if they were alive. The guilt was crushing, unbearable, and utterly pointless. There was nothing he could do directly to free them. But there was one thing he could do: end the war faster. If he could not save his family by being with them, he could save them by destroying every ship, every aircraft, every supply line that kept Japanese forces in the Philippines. This was not official policy or approved strategy. This was personal vengeance disguised as innovation, grief channeled into technical problem-solving, rage transformed into unauthorized aircraft modifications. When Gunn began modifying A-20 Havoc light bombers in August 1942 without authorization, removing bombardiers from transparent noses and installing 450 caliber machine guns in their place, he was not thinking about tactical doctrine or strategic implications. He was thinking about his family starving in Santo Tomas while Japanese supply convoys sailed unmolested to Manila. High-altitude bombing was proving catastrophically ineffective, with B-17 flying fortresses hitting less than 1% of their targets. Japanese ships were resupplying their garrisons with impunity, while Allied bombers dropped tons of ordnance harmlessly into the ocean. Gunn looked at those bombers and saw wasted potential. All that speed and firepower, all those engines and guns, configured entirely wrong for the mission. He started changing them, one aircraft at a time, working essentially alone, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters and mounting them in attack aircraft. It was unauthorized, possibly illegal, and absolutely necessary. His family's survival depended on shortening the war, and shortening the war required better weapons than the ones he had been given. Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane, Australia, in late July 1942 to find a command in complete disarray. His predecessor had been relieved, morale was abysmal, equipment was inadequate, and the Japanese controlled the air over New Guinea while threatening Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, the theater commander, had no confidence in his air forces and made that opinion abundantly clear during their first meeting. MacArthur subjected Kenney to an hour-long lecture about the shortcomings of Allied air power, cataloging every failure and missed opportunity. Most officers would have responded with defensiveness or excuses, but Kenney, a 53-year-old World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star, listened politely and then asked for one thing: authority to send home anyone he considered deadwood. MacArthur, surprised by the audacity of the request, agreed immediately. Within weeks, Kenney had reshuffled his entire command structure, bringing in aggressive younger officers and creating a forward headquarters in New Guinea under Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead, who would have authority to modify operations based on weather and tactical conditions rather than waiting for orders from Brisbane. But personnel changes meant nothing without effective weapons, and the weapons Kenney inherited were failing catastrophically. Allied bombing from medium and high altitude was proving almost entirely ineffective against Japanese ships, which were the critical targets in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The B-17 flying fortresses, America's premier heavy bomber, were hitting less than 1% of their targets when attacking ships at sea. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Hundreds of bombing missions, thousands of pounds of ordnance dropped, and almost no ships sunk. Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons in New Guinea with impunity, bringing fresh troops, ammunition, food, and fuel, while Allied bombers circled overhead, dropping bombs that rarely came close to hitting anything. The problem was fundamental to the nature of high-altitude bombing. From 5,000 feet or higher, there was a significant delay between bomb release and impact, giving ships time to maneuver. Even a modest course change was sufficient to move a ship completely out of the bomb pattern by the time the ordnance reached sea level. Kenny had been thinking about alternatives to high-altitude bombing since 1928, when he was an instructor at the Air Corps Tactical School. He had theorized about skip bombing, releasing bombs at very low altitude so they would skip across the water like stones on a pond, slamming into the sides of ships below the waterline where armor was weakest and hulls were most vulnerable. The concept was aerodynamically sound and offered several advantages over conventional bombing. At low altitude, there was minimal time between release and impact, giving ships no opportunity to maneuver. Bombs striking below the waterline caused more catastrophic damage than those hitting superstructures. The incompressibility of water would enhance blast effects, transmitting shockwaves with devastating efficiency. But the tactical execution was proving extraordinarily difficult. B-17s lacked forward-firing armament beyond a few defensive machine guns, meaning they had no way to suppress anti-aircraft fire during their approach. Coming in at mast height meant flying through withering defensive fire with nothing to silence the gunners. Several attempts at skip bombing had failed disastrously, with bombers shot down before reaching their targets. Then, in August 1942, Kenny discovered Paul Gunn, and everything changed. Intelligence reached Kenny's headquarters that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying A-20 Havoc light bombers without authorization, and rather than immediately court-martialing whoever was responsible, Kenny decided to investigate personally. What he found was Captain Paul Gunn working essentially alone in a maintenance hangar, scavenging 50 caliber machine guns from wrecked fighters and mounting them in the noses of A-20s where bombardiers normally sat. The modifications were crude. By engineering standards, hand-fabricated mounting brackets, jury-rigged ammunition feeds, improvised gun sights, but they were functionally effective. Gunn had removed the transparent nose sections and bombardiers, replacing them with 4 forward-firing heavy machine guns that the pilot could operate. The idea was elegantly simple: strafe Japanese positions at extremely low altitude, suppressing ground fire with overwhelming firepower before dropping bombs. Gunn had taught himself aircraft modification through pure trial and error, understanding aircraft structures, weight distribution, and weapons systems from 2 decades of hands-on experience rather than formal engineering training. Most officers would have immediately shut down Gunn's unauthorized modifications and possibly brought charges. Kenny did the opposite. He recognized in Gunn exactly what he needed: someone who understood aircraft intimately, someone willing to violate regulations to achieve results, someone motivated by more than career advancement or following orders. Kenny immediately assigned Gunn to his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him an impossible mission: modify every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack and do it immediately, without waiting for authorization from Washington or approval from Wright Field. Gunn worked 18-hour days, scrounging weapons from crashed aircraft, fabricating mounting brackets in makeshift workshops, and personally test-flying each modification to ensure it was airworthy. He added 4 50 caliber machine guns to the nose of each A-20, mounted additional guns along the fuselage for increased firepower, and installed bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs that would slow the bomb's descent and allow the aircraft to escape the blast radius. The modified A-20s began going into combat in September 1942, and the results exceeded everyone's expectations. The first major test came during a raid against a Japanese airfield at Buna in Papua New Guinea. The strafer A-20s approached at treetop level, flying so low that they were invisible to defenders until the last moment. At approximately 1,000 yards from target, the pilots opened fire with all forward guns simultaneously, unleashing a devastating stream of 50 caliber bullets that swept across the airfield like a scythe. Japanese defenders, accustomed to high-altitude bombers they could see coming for minutes and track with anti-aircraft guns, had no time to react to aircraft that appeared suddenly at eye level, traveling at nearly 300 miles per hour. The stream of heavy machine gun fire suppressed anti-aircraft positions, killed or scattered ground crews, and created chaos before the A-20s released their bombs. The attack destroyed dozens of Japanese aircraft on the ground and demonstrated conclusively that low-level strafing could revolutionize air warfare in the Pacific. Japanese air power in the region was dealt a blow from which it would struggle to recover, and all from an unauthorized modification developed by one captain working in a maintenance hangar. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to begin work on similar modifications for B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, recognizing that the Mitchell's larger size, longer range, and greater payload capacity could make it even more effective than the A-20. The B-25 could carry more forward-firing weapons than the smaller A-20, had sufficient range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the A-20 could not, and could absorb more battle damage and still return home if Gunn could turn the Mitchell into a gunship, a flying weapons platform designed primarily for strafing rather than bombing. It would become the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the theater. The mathematics were compelling. One modified B-25 with overwhelming forward firepower could potentially accomplish what previously required coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft types. Gunn began sketching modifications, calculating weight, distributions, and planning how to transform a medium-altitude level bomber into something entirely different. His family was still imprisoned in Santo Tomas, and every modification he made brought him one step closer to ending the war that kept them there. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber had been designed in 1939 as a conventional level bomber for attacking targets from medium altitude, typically between 8,000 and 12,000 feet. It was a twin-engine aircraft with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, powered by two Wright R-2600 radial engines producing 1,700 horsepower each. Normal armament consisted of 650 caliber machine guns positioned defensively throughout the aircraft, plus 3,000 pounds of bombs carried internally. The standard crew complement was 5: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. The aircraft had been named after General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate of air power who had been court-martialed in 1925 for his outspoken criticism of military leadership. Approximately 9,890 B-25s would eventually be built at two North American aviation plants, making it one of the most produced American medium bombers. The B-25 had gained fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs on a daring raid against Tokyo. Launching from the aircraft carrier, USS Hornet, in a mission that required every aircraft to be stripped down and modified for carrier operations, Paul Gunn looked at the B-25 Mitchell and saw potential that no one else recognized, seeing not what the aircraft was, but what it could become. The aircraft's nose section was large enough to mount multiple heavy machine guns in a fixed, forward-firing position. The twin-engine design provided redundancy. Losing one engine to enemy fire would not doom the aircraft, which could limp home on a single engine. The sturdy construction could absorb significant battle damage from anti-aircraft fire. Most importantly for Gunn's purposes, the Mitchell had sufficient range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-range A-20 could not, extending the radius of Allied air power by hundreds of miles. In late 1942, Gunn began modifying B-25s in a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia, working with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative in theater. Fox was officially supposed to ensure that aircraft modifications followed factory specifications and manufacturer recommendations, but he instead became Gunn's co-conspirator in what would become the most successful unauthorized aircraft modification program of World War II. The first challenge was removing the bombardier and his transparent plexiglass nose section, which was necessary to create space for forward-firing guns. This modification saved significant weight by eliminating the bombardier's position, his equipment, and the heavy Norden bomb sight, while also removing a position that was essentially useless for low-altitude attack. High-altitude precision bombing required a bombardier to calculate wind drift, altitude, airspeed, and trajectory, but low-altitude skip bombing required only a pilot with good timing and steady nerves. Gunn replaced the transparent nose with a solid metal nose section housing 450 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all firing forward and operated by the pilot through a master trigger on the control yoke. Each gun had 500 rounds of linked ammunition stored in boxes within the nose, providing approximately 35 seconds of sustained fire before running dry. The M2 Browning had a rate of fire of approximately 850 rounds per minute per gun, meaning 4 guns firing simultaneously could deliver 3,400 rounds per minute, approximately 57 rounds per second, or roughly 180 pounds of projectiles per second when accounting for the weight of 50 caliber bullets. But 4 forward-firing guns were not enough for Gunn, whose modifications were driven by a simple philosophy. Overwhelming firepower saved lives by ending fights quickly. He added 2 more 50 caliber guns in cheek blisters, streamlined fairings on either side of the forward fuselage just below and behind the cockpit. These package guns extended slightly beyond the propeller arc, allowing them to fire forward without bullets passing through the propeller disc, which would have required complex synchronization gear. They were fixed in position, firing forward along the aircraft's center line, adding to the pilot's already formidable firepower. Then Gunn made a radical decision that violated every conventional understanding of bomber defensive armament. The B-25 had a dorsal turret with twin 50 caliber guns mounted behind the cockpit, designed to rotate and defend against attacks from above and behind by Japanese fighters. Gunn locked this turret in the forward firing position, permanently pointing the guns ahead. The co-pilot could now operate these guns using a sight in the cockpit, or the pilot could fire all 8 weapons simultaneously using the master trigger, concentrating the fire of 2 defensive guns into an offensive weapon system. Now the modified B-25 had 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns delivering approximately 180 pounds of projectiles per second at a target, creating a cone of destruction that was utterly devastating to anything in its path. For comparison, a single P-51 Mustang fighter, considered one of the most heavily armed American fighters, carried 6 50 caliber guns. The modified B-25 had the forward firepower of more than 1 complete fighter aircraft, concentrated in a platform that also carried 2,000 pounds of bombs and had significantly longer range and endurance than any fighter. The psychological impact of this firepower would prove as important as the physical destruction it caused. Japanese sailors and soldiers had never encountered anything like the modified B-25, and the sound of 8 heavy machine guns firing simultaneously became synonymous with death. But creating this formidable weapons platform required solving enormous engineering challenges that pushed the limits of what could be accomplished in a field maintenance hangar with limited tools and materials. The modifications created significant engineering problems that would have defeated anyone less experienced than Gunn. Adding substantial weight to the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity dangerously forward, making it nose-heavy and difficult to control during takeoff and landing, when slow speeds amplified the handling problems. Gunn compensated by repositioning heavy equipment toward the rear of the aircraft and adding ballast to the tail section, carefully calculating weight distribution to keep the center of gravity within acceptable limits. The enormous recoil from 8 guns firing simultaneously created structural stress that the aircraft's nose section had never been designed to handle. Each 50 caliber gun produced significant recoil force, and 8 guns multiplied that stress. Gunn reinforced the nose section with additional bracing, welding structural members that distributed the forces throughout the airframe. The guns generated tremendous heat when firing and filled the cockpit with smoke and fumes from combustion, making it difficult for pilots to see and breathe during extended firing runs. Gunn added ventilation systems and moved ammunition storage to reduce fire risk from tracer rounds and hot gun barrels. Most critically, Gunn had to solve the complex problem of gun harmonization, ensuring that all 8 guns converged their fire at a specific point in front of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards. If the guns were not properly aligned, bullets would spray in different directions, creating a dispersed pattern rather than a concentrated point of fire. A ship's superstructure might be hit randomly rather than systematically destroyed. Gunn developed a meticulous ground testing procedure using targets placed at measured distances on a test range, adjusting each gun mount with shims and calibrated tools until all 8 weapons converged precisely at the optimal range. He personally test-fired every modified aircraft, making minute adjustments to gun mounts, refusing to sign off on any aircraft until it met his exacting standards. The entire modification process took approximately 2 weeks per aircraft when working around the clock with trained crews, and Gunn established production line techniques where different teams specialized in different aspects of the modification. By December 1942, he had modified enough B-25s to equip the 90th Bombardment Squadron, which would need new tactics to employ these revolutionary weapons effectively. Allied intelligence had been monitoring Japanese naval movements through ultra-intercepts, the code-breaking operation that had cracked Japanese naval codes and was providing detailed information about enemy plans in near real time. Fleet Radio. Unit Melbourne, known by the acronym FRUMEL, was reading Japanese messages almost as quickly as the intended recipients, giving Allied commanders unprecedented insight into enemy intentions. In late February 1943, FRUMEL intercepted messages indicating that a major Japanese convoy was being assembled at Rabaul on the island of New Britain, and the intelligence was remarkably specific about the operation's scope and purpose. 8. Transport ships would carry approximately 6,900 troops of the 51st Division from Rabaul to Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea, where they would reinforce Japanese forces fighting Allied advances in Papua. 8 destroyers would provide escort, and approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters would fly air cover during the voyage. This was Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea, a critical operation that would determine whether Japanese forces could hold their positions or would be gradually worn down and defeated. General Kenny immediately recognized this convoy as an opportunity to test his modified aircraft and new tactics against the most important target since Pearl Harbor, potentially destroying Japan's ability to reinforce New Guinea in a single decisive action. He assembled every available aircraft in the theater for a coordinated attack that would involve multiple aircraft types operating at different altitudes and executing different roles. The strike force would include B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing, from medium altitude to force ships to maneuver and disrupt formations, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters strafing at low level with their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air cover against Japanese Zeros, and the modified B-25 strafers executing skip bombing attacks that would be the main effort. It would be the largest coordinated air operation in the Southwest Pacific to date, involving approximately 90 aircraft attacking in waves throughout the day. Kenny personally briefed squadron commanders on February 28th, and his orders were explicit and uncompromising. Find the convoy, attack without mercy, give no quarter, sink every ship. This was not a raid or a harassment mission. This was annihilation warfare, and Kenny intended to demonstrate what Allied air power could accomplish when properly equipped and tactically employed. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor at Rabaul under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who flew his flag from the destroyer Shirayuki. The 8 cargo transports, Kyokusei Maru, Kembu Maru, Teo Maru, Nojima, Ayo Maru, Taime Maru, Shinai Maru, and Oigawa Maru, were heavily loaded with troops, ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment. The destroyers Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo formed a protective screen around the transports, maintaining anti-submarine patrols and watching for aircraft. Kimura expected to lose ships during the voyage. Every previous convoy to New Guinea had suffered losses from Allied air attacks, but Japanese commanders believed that enough ships would survive to deliver the bulk of the troops and supplies. The convoy was the strongest force Japan had assembled for a resupply mission, reflecting the desperate importance of reinforcing New Guinea. But Kimura and his superiors were operating on outdated assumptions about Allied air capabilities, having no knowledge of the modified B-25 strafers or the skip bombing tactics that were about to be employed against them. The convoy was spotted on the afternoon of February 28th by a B-24 Liberator on routine patrol, whose crew immediately radioed the position, course, and composition to Allied headquarters. Kenny's command launched reconnaissance aircraft to maintain contact, ensuring the convoy could not escape or alter course without detection. Weather initially favored the Japanese as tropical storms moved through the area, providing cloud cover and reducing visibility that made air attacks difficult and dangerous. Allied aircraft maintained contact but could not attack effectively through the storms, which also meant rough seas that pounded the heavily loaded transports. Troops below decks suffered terribly from seasickness in the crowded holds, and the slow convoy speed of 7 knots, approximately 8 miles per hour, was dictated by the capabilities of the overloaded transports. By nightfall on March 1st, the Japanese had covered approximately 90 miles and were roughly halfway to Lae. The deteriorating weather was welcomed by Kimura, who understood that poor weather meant fewer Allied aircraft and reduced accuracy for those that did attack. On the morning of March 2, 1943, the weather improved slightly, and Allied reconnaissance aircraft regained clear visual contact with the convoy. At approximately 10 a.m., 29 B-17 flying fortresses attacked from 5,000 feet in the first strike of what would become a two-day battle. The high-altitude bombing was predictably ineffective. The B-17s claimed multiple hits in their reports, but Japanese records indicate minimal actual damage, with perhaps one transport slightly damaged. However, the attack served an important tactical purpose by forcing the convoy to alter course repeatedly, slowing progress toward Leh and keeping ships scattered rather than in tight defensive formation. Throughout March 2nd, additional B-17 strikes continued at various altitudes, with the flying fortresses dropping dozens of bombs that forced frantic maneuvering by Japanese ships. Japanese Zero fighters engaged the bombers, shooting down several B-17s and damaging others, while the bombers claimed to have shot down 3 Japanese fighters. But despite the sound and fury, no ships sank during the first day's attacks. The high-altitude bombing was harassing and delaying the convoy but not stopping it, which was exactly what Kenny had expected and planned for. As night fell on March 2nd, Kenny knew the critical attack would come the next morning when weather conditions were forecast to be ideal, and the modified B-25 strafers would execute the tactics they had practiced. Major Ed Larner had briefed his pilots repeatedly on the attack profile, and they had rehearsed skip bombing runs against a wrecked ship on February 28th, practicing the precise timing required for successful attacks. Every pilot understood the mission parameters: approach at extremely low altitude, open fire at 1,000 yards to suppress defenses, release bombs at 200 to 400 yards, and exit rapidly to avoid blast effects and secondary explosions. The strafer guns had been carefully harmonized, so all 8 weapons converged at the optimal range. The ordnance had been loaded with 4 to 5 second delayed fuses that would allow bombs to penetrate hulls before detonating below the waterline. The point of no return was approaching, and everyone involved understood that the next day would determine whether the modified B-25s and skip bombing tactics would succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically, with no middle ground possible. At dawn on March 3, 1943, weather conditions were perfect for the coordinated air attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Clear skies provided excellent visibility, calm seas reduced the difficulty of low-altitude flying, and the Japanese convoy was approximately 30 miles from Leh, close enough that land-based anti-aircraft guns could theoretically provide some support, but still fully exposed to air attack. The Allied strike force assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on the northern coast of Papua, with approximately 90 aircraft converging on the Japanese convoy in what would be the most devastating defeat the Imperial Japanese Navy would suffer from air attack during the entire Pacific War. The attack began at approximately 10 a.m. with B-17 striking first from medium altitude, forcing ships to maneuver and dividing their attention. Then the Beaufighters came in at wave-top height, their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns strafing ships and suppressing anti-aircraft fire. The destroyers opened fire with everything they had, filling the sky with shells and tracers. But the closing speed of low-flying aircraft was too fast for manual tracking and aiming. Then, the modified B-25 strafers arrived, and the systematic destruction of the Japanese convoy began in earnest with a violence and efficiency that stunned even the Allied pilots executing the attacks. The success of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where all 8 transports and 4 destroyers were sunk with over 5,700 Japanese casualties for the loss of only 4 Allied aircraft, led to immediate and dramatic expansion of the strafer modification program throughout the Southwest Pacific Theater. General Kenny ordered that all available B-25s in theater be converted to strafer configuration as quickly as possible, recognizing that the modified aircraft represented a revolutionary capability that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the region. Paul Gunn worked even harder than before, training additional maintenance crews in modification techniques, refining procedures to increase production speed, and establishing quality control standards to ensure every aircraft met his exacting requirements. By mid-1943, the majority of B-25s in the Southwest Pacific had been modified with forward-firing guns and pilots were being trained in the low-altitude attack tactics that made the strafers so effective. The modifications were no longer unauthorized experiments. They had become official policy, validated by combat results that exceeded even Kenny's optimistic projections. But success brought new challenges, including the need to scale up production and formalize what had been improvised field modifications. North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25 Mitchell, took notice of what was happening in the Pacific Theater and sent company representatives to examine Gunn's modifications firsthand. The company's technical experts were initially skeptical that field modifications could improve on factory designs, but when they saw the combat results and examined the engineering solutions Gunn had developed, they requested detailed specifications and manufacturing drawings. North American Aviation wanted to incorporate Gunn's innovations into factory production, producing strafer variants that would be built new rather than modified in the field. Gunn was promoted to major and sent back to the United States to work directly with North American Aviation at their Englewood, California, and Kansas City, Kansas plants. He spent several months in 1943 and early 1944 working with company engineers to translate his field modifications into factory production processes. The collaboration was not always smooth. Gunn's practical, hands-on approach sometimes conflicted with the engineering department's emphasis on formal analysis and documentation, but eventually the factory began producing purpose-built strafer variants that incorporated and improved upon Gunn's original modifications. The first factory-produced strafer variant was the B-25G, which mounted a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose along with 4 50 caliber machine guns in an attempt to create an even more powerful anti-shipping weapon. 405 B-25Gs were built, featuring the large caliber cannon that fired a 14 7-pound shell capable of penetrating ship armor or destroying fortified bunkers with a single hit. The 75mm cannon was based on the same weapon used in M4 Sherman tanks, adapted for aircraft installation with modifications to reduce recoil forces. However, the cannon proved problematic in actual combat use. It was difficult to load in flight, requiring a dedicated crew member in the nose to handle the heavy shells, had a slow rate of fire of only 6 to 8 rounds per minute, and the recoil was severe enough to slow the aircraft noticeably with each shot. Gunn personally tested the B-25G in combat, leading a raid with the 3rd Attack Group against a Japanese destroyer in which he claimed to have disabled the ship's fire control system with a direct hit from the 75mm cannon. The destroyer was subsequently sunk by conventional bombs from other aircraft, and while Gunn publicly insisted he had sunk the destroyer with the cannon, he privately admitted that bombs had finished the job. The B-25H followed the G model into production with modifications based on combat experience and feedback from operational squadrons. 1,000 B-25Hs were built, retaining the 75mm cannon but adding 14 50 caliber machine guns positioned throughout the aircraft in various locations, 4 in the nose alongside the cannon, 4 in cheek blisters, 2 in the relocated dorsal turret, 2 in waist positions, and 2 in the tail. The H model represented the peak of the strafer concept, with firepower that exceeded any other bomber in any air force worldwide. However, the massive armament came at significant costs. The aircraft was nose-heavy and difficult to control, required extensive crew training to manage all the weapon systems, and the weight of guns and ammunition reduced bomb load and range. Wright Field, the Army Air Force's Development Center, sent Gunn a message stating that the modifications created dangerous handling characteristics and recommending that B-25Hs be grounded until the center of gravity issues were resolved through engineering redesign. Legend has it that Gunn replied with characteristic bluntness, "Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." Whether this exact exchange occurred is uncertain, but it perfectly captured Gunn's philosophy that combat effectiveness mattered more than engineering perfection or adherence to peacetime safety standards. The final production variant, the B-25J, represented a compromise between conventional bombing and strafer configurations, with some aircraft built with traditional bombardier noses for level bombing while others retained the solid strafer nose with forward-firing guns. 4318 B-25Js were built, making it the most numerous variant of all Mitchell models. Some B-25Js were equipped with 18 50 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in cheek blisters, 2 in the forward dorsal turret, and 4 in wasties. Positions, creating the most heavily armed bomber of World War II. The firepower was arguably excessive for most combat situations, but it had enormous psychological impact on enemy forces who learned to fear the distinctive sound of Wright R-2600 engines. Japanese troops throughout the Pacific came to recognize that sound as a harbinger of death, and the mere presence of B-25s overhead could disrupt operations and lower morale, even if no attack occurred. The strafer variants also gained nicknames that reflected their destructive capabilities. Bat out of hell was common, referring to the way modified B-25s appeared without warning at minimum altitude, unleashed devastating firepower, and disappeared before defenses could respond effectively. Throughout 1943 and 1944, modified B-25s devastated Japanese targets across the Pacific theater, with a systematic thoroughness that demonstrated the effectiveness of Gunn's innovations and Kenny's tactical employment. In August 1943, B-25 strafers attacked Japanese airfields at Wewak in New Guinea in a series of raids that destroyed 174 aircraft on the ground, breaking the back of Japanese air power in the region and enabling Allied ground forces to advance with minimal air opposition. The Wewak raids were made possible because Gunn had solved the problem of insufficient range by developing a technique using auxiliary fuel tanks carried in the bomb bay. Once the fuel was consumed, the tanks were jettisoned through an opening in the bomb bay floor. The system was crude, with fuel fumes permeating the fuselage and cold air rushing through the aircraft, but it extended operational range by several hundred miles and made previously unreachable targets vulnerable. The destruction of Japanese air power at Wewak represented a turning point in the New Guinea campaign, eliminating the air cover that had protected Japanese ground forces and supply lines. In November 1943, B-25 strafers executed one of the war's most spectacular raids against Rabaul Harbor, which was heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns, shore batteries, and fighter aircraft, making it one of the most dangerous targets in the Pacific. Major Raymond Jock Hennebrey led 38 B-25s against shipping concentrated in the harbor in a coordinated attack that occurred at masthead height, with P-38 Lightnings providing fighter cover at altitude and phosphorus bombs creating smokescreens to obscure the attackers. The raid achieved results that stunned both Allied and Japanese commanders. Of 38 vessels in the harbor, 30 received direct hits from strafing or bombs. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transport and support ships were sunk or damaged so severely they were unable to operate. The raid effectively paralyzed Rabaul as a forward naval base, demonstrating that even the strongest Japanese defensive positions were vulnerable to modified B-25s, employing the tactics Gunn and Larner had developed. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. If Rabaul could be successfully attacked, nowhere was safe, and the myth of secure rear areas evaporated under the reality of low-altitude strafer attacks that came without warning and left devastation in their wake. Throughout the period when modified B-25s were transforming Pacific warfare, Paul Gunn's personal war continued with undiminished intensity, driven by the knowledge that his family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas while he fought thousands of miles away. Letters occasionally reached him through Red Cross channels, but communication was sporadic, heavily censored by Japanese authorities, and often months out of date by the time it arrived. He knew from these fragmentary communications that conditions in the internment camp were deteriorating steadily as the war turned against Japan. Food became increasingly scarce as Japanese supply lines were disrupted, ironically, partially due to the very strafer attacks Gunn had pioneered. Disease spread through the crowded camp facilities where thousands of civilians were confined in buildings designed for a fraction of that number. Japanese guards became harsher and more unpredictable as defeats mounted and their own situations grew desperate. Gunn could do nothing directly to improve his family's circumstances, could not send them food or medicine or protection, could not even know with certainty whether they were still alive between the arrival of infrequent letters. The only thing he could do was fight harder, fly more missions, develop more effective weapons, hoping each innovation and each successful attack brought the war's end one day closer. In late 1944, American forces invaded Leyte in the Philippines as part of General MacArthur's campaign to liberate the islands, and Gunn was there. still flying combat missions at age 45 when most men his age were in staff positions far from the front lines. He had been repeatedly offered safer assignments, promotions that would have taken him out of combat. But he refused every attempt to remove him from operational flying because the Philippines meant proximity to his family and a chance to participate directly in their liberation. On a night in late 1944, Japanese bombers attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte, where American forces were establishing forward air operations. Gunn was on the ground when white phosphorus bombs exploded nearby, and fragments tore into his right shoulder, causing massive tissue damage and shattering bone. White phosphorus burns are among the most painful wounds possible, as the chemical continues burning as long as it remains in contact with tissue, creating ongoing damage that is excruciating and difficult to treat. The wound was severe enough that it rendered his right arm essentially useless, ending any possibility of continuing to fly combat missions that required full use of both arms to control the aircraft. Gunn was evacuated to Australia for medical treatment and spent months in recovery, enduring multiple surgeries as doctors attempted to repair the extensive damage to his shoulder. The wound effectively ended his combat flying career, but by late 1944, his war was nearly over anyway. The Allied advance through the Philippines was proceeding rapidly, and Manila's liberation was only a matter of time. The question was whether Gunn's family would survive long enough to be liberated, as reports filtering out from the Philippines indicated that Japanese forces were executing prisoners and destroying evidence of war crimes as American forces closed in. In January 1945, American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf and began advancing toward Manila, meeting fierce resistance from Japanese defenders who had decided to fight to the death rather than surrender. The battle for Manila would become one of the most destructive urban battles of World War II, with Japanese forces deliberately destroying the city and massacring civilians in an orgy of violence that reflected their desperation and rage. Santo Tomas internment camp sat in the middle of this battle zone, and as fighting intensified, the danger to internees increased exponentially. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division formed a flying column, a fast-moving mechanized force that bypassed Japanese strongpoints to reach critical objectives quickly and race through Manila's streets toward Santo Tomas. The cavalry arrived just as Japanese guards were, preparing to execute the camp's leadership, and possibly all internees, as retreating Japanese forces throughout the Philippines were killing prisoners rather than allowing them to be liberated. In the chaos of Manila's street fighting, with buildings burning and firefights erupting constantly, American soldiers freed over 4,000 internees who had survived 3 years and 14 days of imprisonment. Among those liberated were Polly Gunn and her 4 children, Paul Jr. and Nathan, now young men aged 19 and 17, and Connie and Julie, now teenagers who had spent their formative years in captivity. They had survived through Polly's determination, the support of fellow internees, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up hope. But survival had come at enormous cost. They were emaciated, traumatized, and marked by experiences that no family should endure. The boys had been separated from their mother and sisters when the Japanese segregated male and female prisoners, forced to survive on their own while worrying constantly about their family members. The girls had watched their mother slowly starve herself to give them larger portions of the meager rations. All of them had witnessed death, disease, and brutality that would leave psychological scars for the rest of their lives. General MacArthur personally visited Santo Tomas shortly after liberation, walking through the camp to witness the conditions and speak with survivors who represented the American civilians he had been forced to abandon in 1942. MacArthur was deeply affected by what he saw: skeletal figures in ragged clothes, makeshift graves, evidence of systematic deprivation and cruelty. And he made immediate arrangements for the Gunn family to receive priority medical care and transportation. He ordered that Polly and the children be flown to Australia as soon as they were medically stable enough for the journey, recognizing that reuniting them with Pappy Gunn was both a personal priority and symbolic of the liberation that American forces were bringing to the Philippines. The reunion occurred several weeks after liberation, delayed by the need for medical treatment and the chaotic conditions in Manila, where fighting continued for weeks. When Pappy Gunn finally held his family again after 3 years, 2 months, and 4 days of separation, They were together but fundamentally changed by their experiences. The man who had left Manila on Christmas Eve, 1941, was reuniting with a family that had survived what he could not prevent. Gunn remained in the Army Air Forces after recovering sufficiently from his wounds to perform non-combat duties. Though his flying days were effectively over due to the permanent damage to his shoulder, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and continued working on aircraft modifications and tactical development, applying the lessons learned from 3 years of combat to training programs and doctrine that would guide the post-war Air Force. He officially retired from military service on June 30, 1948, receiving a medical retirement with the rank of full colonel, an honor that recognized both his contributions and his sacrifices. His decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster, indicating a second award for separate acts of heroism, the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct, the Air Medal for sustained aerial achievement, and 9 Purple Hearts representing 9 separate occasions on which he was wounded or injured in combat. 9 Purple Hearts was an extraordinary number that testified to Gunn's refusal to accept safe assignments, his insistence on flying combat missions despite repeated wounds, and his willingness to place himself in danger again and again throughout the war. After retiring from the military, Gunn returned to the Philippines and worked to re-establish Philippine Airlines, the civilian carrier he had managed before the war and which had been completely destroyed during the Japanese occupation. The country was rebuilding from years of brutal occupation and the massive destruction caused by liberation fighting, with Manila reduced to rubble and infrastructure throughout the islands destroyed or damaged. Air transportation was critical for reconnecting islands that had been isolated, delivering supplies to remote areas, and supporting reconstruction efforts. Gunn helped restore commercial aviation services, obtaining aircraft, training pilots, establishing routes, and rebuilding the airline from nothing. He was still flying at age 57, still taking risks that younger men might avoid, still pushing limits and refusing to acknowledge that age or injuries should slow him down. His family had survived, the war was over, and he had returned to doing what he loved most, flying. But the years of combat and the lasting effects of his wounds had taken their toll on his health and stamina in ways he refused to acknowledge. On October 11, 1957, 7 days before what would have been his 58th birthday, Gunn was piloting a charter flight when his aircraft encountered a severe tropical storm over the Philippines. The details of what happened are unclear, whether mechanical failure, pilot error, weather conditions, or some combination caused the crash. But the aircraft went down and Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, died doing what he had done for nearly 40 years, flying. Some who knew him suggested that he might have preferred this ending to a slow decline from age and injuries, dying in the cockpit rather than in a hospital bed. He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, where he had once been an instructor teaching young aviators the skills and judgment that would keep them alive in combat. The cemetery overlooks the waters where he had first learned to fly in the 1920s, completing a circle that had taken him from enlisted naval aviator to airline manager to Army Air Forces innovator, to the man whose unauthorized modifications had helped win the Pacific War. His gravestone listed his rank, his service dates, and his decorations, but it could not capture the complexity of a man driven by grief to create weapons that killed thousands while saving his family. Paul Gunn's legacy lived on in multiple forms, extending far beyond his personal story to influence military aviation doctrine, aircraft design, and tactical thinking for decades after his death. The B-25 strafer modifications he pioneered remained standard throughout World War II and influenced post-war development of ground attack aircraft in air forces worldwide. Approximately 9,890 B-25 Mitchells were built during the war, and thousands were configured as strafers based directly on Gunn's designs, making his unauthorized field modifications one of the most widely adopted aircraft modifications in military history. The skip bombing technique he helped perfect destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships and contributed significantly to Allied victory in the Pacific by isolating Japanese garrisons from resupply and establishing Allied air superiority over contested waters. Military academies and staff colleges studied the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a case study in how intelligence, coordination, innovative weapons, and new tactics could achieve complete victory at minimal cost. The mathematics were simple and, Brutal. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, over 5,000 casualties, all for the loss of 4 Allied aircraft, a kill ratio that demonstrated what properly employed air power could accomplish against naval forces. Gunn's story demonstrated that innovation could come from unexpected sources, that effective weapons development did not require formal engineering degrees or approval from centralized bureaucracies, and that desperate circumstances could drive innovations that peacetime planning would never produce. The official military establishment had wanted to fight World War II with existing weapons and approved tactics, following doctrine developed in peacetime and tested in controlled conditions. Gunn showed that combat reality required different approaches, that modifications made by a grieving father in a maintenance hangar could be more effective than designs produced by teams of engineers in corporate facilities. His success validated the concept of field modifications and empowered other innovators throughout the military to experiment with unauthorized changes when they identified tactical problems that existing equipment could not solve. The lesson was not that regulations should be ignored or that unauthorized modifications were always wise. Many such experiments failed or created dangerous situations, but rather that rigid adherence to approved procedures could be as dangerous as reckless experimentation when facing enemies who adapted quickly to new circumstances. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became studied in military academies worldwide as an example of how the combination of intelligence, proper tactics, and innovative weapons could achieve decisive results that changed strategic situations. The battle demonstrated several principles that remained relevant in later conflicts. Intelligence gathering was essential for identifying high-value targets. Coordination between different aircraft types multiplied effectiveness, suppressing enemy defenses. Before attacking was more efficient than accepting casualties, and destroying supplies before they reached the battlefield was more cost-effective than fighting battles against supplied enemies. Every ship sunk in the Bismarck Sea represented dozens of combat missions that would never be flown by the troops who drowned, hundreds of soldiers who would never fight, thousands of rounds of ammunition that would never be fired at Allied forces. Destroying logistics before they reached the front lines was the most efficient form of warfare, and the modified B-25 became the weapon system that made this strategy viable across the vast distances of the Pacific Theater, where naval supply lines were vulnerable to air attack in ways that land-based logistics were not. Japan learned the lessons of the Bismarck Sea too late to adapt effectively, and the defeat fundamentally altered Japanese operational planning for the remainder of the war. After the battle, Japanese commanders knew they could no longer move large convoys in daylight within range of Allied air bases, and they switched to nighttime movements, used submarines for critical supplies, and increasingly relied on barge traffic that could hide in coastal waters during daylight hours. These measures reduced but did not eliminate losses, as B-25 strafers proved equally effective against barges and small craft, and night-flying B-25s equipped with primitive radar found convoys even in darkness. There was no safe time, no safe method, and no safe place for Japanese logistics operations in the Southwest Pacific once Allied air forces achieved dominance. The stranglehold tightened month by month until Japanese garrisons were effectively isolated, fighting on with dwindling supplies and no realistic hope of reinforcement. In New Guinea, in the Philippines, throughout the Pacific Islands, Japanese troops demonstrated extraordinary courage and tenacity, but were ultimately defeated not by direct combat, but by the severing of their supply lines through air attacks that their defenses could not stop. The modified B-25's influence extended beyond World War II into post-war military aviation development, with the concept of the gunship, an aircraft designed primarily for delivering gun attack rather than bombing, becoming standard in many air forces. The AC-47 Spooky, AC-119 Shadow and Stinger, and AC-130 Spectre gunships used extensively in Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts were conceptual descendants of Gunn's modified B-25s, employing the same basic principle of overwhelming forward firepower delivered from low-altitude platforms. These gunships used different technologies, side-firing weapons rather than forward-firing, sophisticated sensors and fire control systems, vastly more ammunition capacity. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged: converting transport, or cargo aircraft into heavily armed platforms that could suppress ground fire and deliver devastating attacks. The psychological impact was also similar, as enemy forces in Vietnam and later conflicts learned to fear the sound of gunship engines the same way Japanese forces had learned to fear the distinctive roar of B-25 Wright R-2600 engines. The evolution, from Gunn's improvised modifications to purpose-built gunships, demonstrated how wartime innovations influenced peacetime development when they proved effective in combat. Of the 9,890 B-25s built during World War II, over 100 survive today in museums and private collections, most in the United States, but with examples preserved in countries around the world. Many are maintained in flying condition by organizations dedicated to preserving aviation history, appearing at air shows where crowds marvel at their size, sound, and the history they represent. The distinctive roar of Wright R-2600 engines is unforgettable to anyone who has heard a B-25 fly, and the sight of one banking low over an airfield, as they once did over Japanese ships in their final seconds, reminds observers of what these aircraft accomplished and the courage required to fly them into combat. Several flying B-25s are configured as strafers with forward-firing guns in the nose, and when these guns are fired during demonstrations using blank ammunition, the sound is overwhelming even without live rounds. The muzzle blast is visible. As flame and smoke, the aircraft shudders noticeably from the recoil of 8 heavy machine guns, and watching such demonstrations gives viewers a glimpse of what Japanese sailors experienced when strafer B-25s attacked their ships at masthead, height with all guns blazing. In 1959, General George Kenney, by then retired, published The Saga of Pappy Gunn, a biography intended to ensure that Gunn's contributions were not forgotten in the broader narrative of World War II, where individual innovators often disappeared into organizational histories. Kenney wrote that Gunn was one of the most important individuals in the Pacific War, a man whose unauthorized actions had saved thousands of Allied lives by shortening the war, and whose innovations had fundamentally changed how air power was employed against naval and ground targets. The book detailed Gunn's modifications, his combat missions, and his personal war to free his family, presenting him as an example of American ingenuity and determination. Nathaniel Gunn, Pappy's youngest son, also wrote about his father's story and the family's experience in Santo Tomas, providing perspectives on life in the internment camp and the psychological cost of 3 years of imprisonment. The Gunn family story became an example of the human cost of war, the strength required to endure impossible circumstances, and the way personal tragedy could drive military innovation. The story of how one man's unauthorized modifications created a devastating weapon system remained relevant as a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that necessity drives invention more effectively than committee planning, and that refusing to accept failure as inevitable can produce extraordinary results when combined with technical skill and institutional support from leaders like Kenney, who recognized effectiveness over proper procedure.